So, let me paint you a picture. A picture of a man. Straight, white, mid to late 20s, 6 feet tall. Let's make it 6'6". Roguishly charming. Wields a katana. Has a six-pack. Has two. Enters every room doing a sick backflip. Ladies. Has been described as both epic and a gamer. His father invented the skateboard, and he mastered it. Not balding. Definitely not balding. That man, ladies and gentlemen, is me. And I mention this only so that you all know how far I am outside the target demographic for something like She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. I'm usually too cool and manly for this rainbow baby shit. Too busy abseiling oceans or whatever it is I do. So it comes as a shocking personal surprise that watching this show has somehow become my TV highlight of 2020. 2020, a year where there has been nothing else to do but watch TV. Of all the options out there, I had the most fun with this one. And that's something that I've been thinking about. Why this show? Why did I like it so much more than I expected I would? And the answer is character. There are elements of She-Ra which range from good to passable to subpar, but the absolute standout quality of the show is its characters, who are so much more engaging and relatable and lifelike than I felt they had any right to be, except Swiftwind. So the question becomes, more specifically, what are the things that She-Ra did with its characters which made them so endearing to its audience? And I've tried to narrow that down to 3 core features of the writing which the show employed to build that bond between the characters on screen and the viewer, which I have pretentiously titled The 3 C's of Character, which are circumstance, cognition, and C, funny maymays, or comedy. So that's this video. I'm going to go through each of these points, explaining how I believe the show implemented them to build strong, sympathetic characters, and highlighting moments from the show which demonstrate that. So let's just do it. So the first writing technique that I want to talk about is circumstance. And by circumstance, what I mean is putting a character in the right situation at the right time to get the most out of them, both in terms of maximizing the character's growth and screen presence, as well as adding value to the story as an experience. You can have a character whose every aspect of their life and backstory you have meticulously detailed, who you think is the most amazing, entertaining character ever imagined, but unless that character is in a scenario where they're being challenged in the right way, or in a setting where their specific characteristics aren't really relevant to the surrounding events, it's going to be very difficult to showcase what that character brings to the table in a way that doesn't feel forced. So with that in mind, a story with a good understanding of circumstance knows where to put its characters, with whom and when, in order to display what that character is about, what they can contribute to the narrative, and why you should care about them, in a way that feels the most natural and knows when to change the situation in order to keep things fresh for the audience. From She-Ra, I can think of no finer example of this than Entrapta. Entrapta is one of the princesses that make up the magical elemental system that keeps the planet in balance. At the centre of it all is She-Ra, the princess of power, then water, air, fire and nature. Ice is separate to water, fine. The moon? But kind of teleportation and magic sparkles, but I think the moon is this, that's what it's representing. Nets, I don't know. Scorpions, and of course Entrapta with technomancy and / or prehensile hair manipulation. I guess when you inherit your world building from a 1980s toy commercial, this is the sort of weird shit that you're gonna run into. But to get back on track, after No Princess Left Behind, where Entrapta gets fucking burned to death in front of everyone, keeping her in the hands of Catra and the Horde is one of the most decisions the story makes throughout its run. I didn't take a lot of notice of Entrapta in her initial episode. Yeah, she's the science princess, yeah, she's the techie member of the team, so what? But having her interact with the bad guys so extensively exposes so much more about Entrapta. Her development and contribution to the show is better served with the Horde than it is the Rebellion. We get just enough of an introduction to Entrapta as the good guy to see her have some spirited but not particularly meaningful interactions with the heroes, which suggests she finds interaction awkward. But it's only once she's with the Horde that these feelings can be played upon, both by the show to deepen Entrapta's character and by Catra to further her efforts of conquest. This is the show taking advantage of circumstance, putting Entrapta with a character whose interactions will most naturally yield what the writer wants to tell the audience about her. Catra has something to benefit from exposing Entrapta's insecurities, thus their interactions will more likely highlight them, and thus the audience gets a much more efficient understanding of Entrapta's character than they would otherwise. Putting her with the Horde also reveals Entrapta's true allegiance is to science, in a way that wouldn't be as meaningful had she remained with the protagonist, because if all of her interactions with tech had been under the context of working with the heroes, it wouldn't be as apparent that she holds her allegiance to science, regardless of what that means or who gets hurt in the process. And not even in a Machiavellian, the ends justify the means kind of a way, more like a dumb puppy with no attention span, unable to resist the draw of any new stimulus. Have you ever seen that Casey Green comic with a wizard who magics up too many shotguns and just leaves them lying on the ground because wizards have no concept of right or wrong? That is Entrapta. Anyway, one of the best parts about putting Entrapta in this circumstance is that her inventions and her understandings of are hugely influential in driving both the plot forward and which direction the war is going, despite the fact that, as we now know, Entrapta herself is largely divorced from the outcome of that. So they've set up this really fun to watch scenario where Adora and Catra are intently focused on defeating each other and the fate of the whole world, with Entrapta as this pivot in the middle, turning the tides, except her priorities are on a completely different spectrum, and you can probably guess which one. It's a side effect which wouldn't have come about had the writers kept Entrapta on board with the protagonists and tried to resolve her issues through the best friend squad. In fact, Catra, Entrapta and Scorpia form an antagonistic trio to Adora, Bow and Glimmer's heroic trio. And while the protags and some of the other villains will get their chance to shine later on, for the first 2 or 3 seasons, these 3 are by far the most entertaining characters. Catra, who devoted herself to Adora despite spending a lifetime in her shadow, only to be betrayed and abandoned at the drop of a hat. Entrapta, whose eccentricities and obsessions have distanced her from those around her, to the point that she's convinced herself that she can't relate to other people. Scorpia, a loyal, optimistic, fundamentally good person caught on the wrong side of a conflict. Her heritage stolen by the Horde and her cheery, tolerant disposition belies her low self-esteem and insecurity. Simply put, these 3 characters are complete misfits, and in finding each other they find this sense of belonging which the wider world had failed to provide them. That's the reason that these 3 are so entertaining to watch. There's nothing wrong with Team Protag in the early seasons. They have plenty of fun moments, but their sunshine and rainbow BFF forever approach to taking down an evil alien empire is so much less relatable than the dorky, brooding insecurity of feeling like an outsider, and that's what the bad guys have got going on. I mean, when it comes down to it, what are conquest, subjugation and war crimes when compared to that feeling of belonging? Who can honestly say that they haven't, broken the Geneva Convention just to try and fit in? During season 3, that trio, as entertaining as it is, has largely served its narrative purpose, and Entrapta's circumstance changes again, so that now she's sharing a lot more of her screen time with Hordak, now acting as an impetus for the story enriching his character. Hordak could not have possibly began as more of a stock villain. He's an evil overlord that wants to conquer the world. He looks like a creepy vampire skeleton and spends most of his time in a sanctum, which, as far as I understand it, means a room for the exclusive use of creepy vampire skeletons. His backstory with Horde Prime and his shame regarding his physical defects has left him with an obsession for perfection and fuels his drive to conquer Etheria, something which remains largely unchallenged before the story addresses Hordak's insecurities through his interactions with Entrapta. Entrapta's scientific worth to the Horde and her utter ignorance of social norms puts her in a good position to share a lot of screen time with Hordak, and getting her there via her association with Catra is done almost seamlessly. Her inability to gauge people means she's one of the only characters who isn't scared of him, and thanks to her natural problem-solving skills, she's come to see imperfections as more of a thing that provide character rather than subtract value. Her unique perspective of the world has pretty obvious implications for Hordak and his backstory, but it's not simply her words that change him, it's her ability to back that up with actions in a language that he understands, through science and invention, which calls Hordak to question his own perspectives and allow him to see value in himself. What begins as a necessity becomes respect and eventually affection. It's a genuinely sincere attempt at humanizing a character who might have been overlooked or deemed unworthy otherwise. It's nothing new for a show to give its bad guys redemptive arcs or sympathetic backstories, and while Catra is the most obvious choice and gets the most mileage out of that, it deepens the story to also give Hordak a similar yet distinct enough path to self-acceptance. And it keeps things fresh by doing it through one of the show's most unexpected relationships, if not one of its more endearing. That's the brilliance of how She-Ra moves its characters around to get the most out of them. Entrapta wouldn't have gotten the development she received from Catra and Scorpia had she stayed with the good guys, and Hordak couldn't have gotten his development from Catra or Scorpia. The show's ability to move Entrapta through the Horde hierarchy so naturally opens up the opportunity for more meaningful and entertaining character interactions. It's the same thing that happens with Shadow Weaver Switch. Once her part is played in deepening Catra's wounds to expose the desperation in her character, the show wastes no time in moving Shadow Weaver over to Bright Moon, where she can add some edge to Glimmer's character and test the relationship between her and Adora. Hell, the whole show is predicated on Adora jumping ships, which catastrophically changes the nature of her relationship with Catra, but even when they're mortal enemies, the writers find a way of putting them in non-combative circumstances, sometimes for entire episodes, because that's the most effective way of furthering their development. With Cognition, it's more to do with putting the audience in the shoes of the character. Circumstance is about marrying up the overall narrative to each character's individual storyline in a way that is mutually beneficial. The narrative finds a space in which the character can be as engaging and relatable as possible, except Swiftwind, making the audience more fond of that character and as a result more invested in the overall narrative. It's a method of building an emotional connection between the viewer and the characters. Cognition is different in that it doesn't necessarily have to be emotional in order to be successfully done. You don't necessarily have to agree with or like a character to understand their motives. Cognition here is how well the story communicates the decision making of its characters in a way that follows some kind of logic. All stories will do this on some level without doubt, and as long as a line of logic can be established, it's a success. But the more messy and complex a character's internal workings are, the more difficult but also the more rewarding it is to have an audience be able to understand them. Now, Circumstance is obviously a great tool for communicating Cognition in this way, and there is overlap where they feed into each other, but that is the beauty of a story that evolves and unfolds. Circumstance is putting a character in an external environment, which may change several times depending on the character's development, which best allows them to demonstrate who they are and where they are on their journey. Cognition is making sure the audience understand the internal environment, and which influences from their backstory, the people around them, their psychology and their emotional status drive the decision-making process that will take them on the next step to their journey or their next circumstance. You can probably guess which character I'm choosing to highlight Cognition, because obviously it's Catra. Catra comes with all the standard difficulties of writing a character, with the added challenge of being very insular. She's not the only character on the show like this, but it's harder to tell an audience what's going on in your character's head if the character themselves lacks the emotional maturity or vocabulary to talk about those feelings, or is in complete denial about them in the first place. There is a lot going on with Catra, but this is probably the most succinct explanation.
Newsflash, asshole! I've been
desperately in love with you
the entire goddamn
story over the initial 2 seasons is one of not even remotely getting over the rejection she feels from Adora, and using her newfound rage to throw herself into the Horde's aims of global domination. She sees her stock rise within the Horde hierarchy, eventually putting her in the good books of the big man himself, Hordak. We see through revelations of her past that Catra was always playing second fiddle to Adora, but that conflictingly Adora was also her only source of comfort and affection, as Catra was routinely singled out for abuse and punishment by their guardian, Shadow Weaver. I don't know why Shadow Weaver adopted Catra. She obviously hates her. I don't know what SW was hoping to get out of that relationship. I mean, in the end, Shadow Weaver does end up dying doing what she loved, emotionally traumatizing her 2 adopted daughters. Anyway, it's for this reason that Catra leaps at the opportunity to usurp Shadow Weaver as Hordak's second in command and locks the weird scary lady up. But no sooner does Catra have what she thought she wanted than things start to go wrong. There is a great added tension to a story when you get invested in the villains like this. As wrong as Catra's actions are, we have a great understanding of her background and the adversity that she has had to overcome to reach her position. So when each victory for the heroes is going to have unfortunate consequences for characters that you care about, you end up having more investment in the outcome of each conflict. As the losses mount up and the story moves Entrapta into her new circumstance of being the closest person to Hordak, Catra can feel her newfound position slipping away from her, and she finds a sympathetic ear in the only other person who knows what it's like to be in her position. Just as Catra feels as though she might have caught a lucky break for once in her life, it's revealed that Shadow Weaver was only toying with her emotions long enough to give herself a chance to escape. This is bad enough to leave Catra an absolute wreck, but the breaking point is when she learns that Shadow Weaver left her to team up with Adora, that despite Catra's lifetime of service to the Horde and abuse under Shadow Weaver's guise, and the fact that Adora betrayed all of that, Shadow Weaver is still choosing to be with Adora over her. Both of them have chosen to be with the enemy and actively undermine everything Catra has done rather than stay with her. And again, Catra's character is so well laid out in her desires, her obstacles, her strengths and her failings that her mental deterioration as a result of what's happened feels like the most natural process in the world. And that's not easy to write. We see a cycle of a character making the same bad, short-sighted, frustrated decisions over and over again, continually isolating herself from the people around her, and it doesn't feel like she's stuck on a loop or being reset and reset each episode. It feels like watching someone trapped by the environment they're in on a torturous descent into despair. Without being too dismissive of the show's narrative on abuse, this is first and foremost compelling viewing, and it makes Catra the show's most compelling figure. To know exactly what is going through her head when she makes those poor choices puts us directly in her place and achieves that rare thing of making the actions of a villain who simply wants to destroy the world sympathetic, even if it's still unjustifiable. Game of Thrones spoilers! Compare this to something like Daenerys' decision to burn King's Landing in Game of Thrones. Something which left viewers confused and angry because it felt more like a cheap plot twist than a natural result of a character reaching breaking point. I'll admit that unlike Dany, Catra has the benefit of being an established villain, but Shira still performs the due diligence of letting the audience see her aims transform, from wanting to rule the world with Adora to wanting to destroy the world in order to beat her. We don't get anything like the same level of insight into Dany's mind as we do Catra. We just get vague guesses about genetic craziness and sad about the BF. And that isn't to say that Dany doesn't have cause to snap. Her dragons get killed, her friend gets murdered, her advisors are turning against her, but without cognition, without the same connective tissue between these stimuli and her reaction that we get with Catra, the moment that Dany snaps seems arbitrary and disingenuous. Up until that point, Dany had faced each contributing hardship with a show of bitter stoicism. a marked development from the more emotional outbursts we'd seen in early seasons. Different people react to events in different ways. That's part of what makes watching fictional characters so entertaining. If you take the stimuli input into Daenerys in Season 8, independent of Dany as a character, and treat that as a motivation, that doesn't necessarily dictate what the response would be. It's only when you combine these stimuli with a character that you begin to understand what the response will be. So for Dany's responses of either grin and bear it or fiery genocide to both be viable, arguable options speaks to how vague and shallow our understanding of Dany's internal processes were at that point in the show. And if characters are going to be written in that way, without conviction, where important decisions are made without being grounded in the character's sensibilities, then there is no point in an audience investing in them, because there's no pattern, there's no reasoning to their actions. Both Daenerys burning down King's Landing and Catra destroying Etheria via the portal are drastic and tragic acts of violence which go against previously established aims of the character. Without cognition, without the audience being given insight as to why those decisions are made, the characters will feel inconsistent and frustrate viewers, and any calls of trying to subvert expectations or delivering a shocking twist will just sound like excuses for bad writing. Cognition is the difference between where She-Ra succeeded with Catra and Game of Thrones failed Daenerys. And this isn't me going full Garth Marenghi. Of course there is a need for subtlety. You can't insult and spoon feed your audience, but I have a great admiration for writing that has such belief in its characters that it takes the audience through every step of their journey. Our shallow perception of Daenerys was intentional. The writers wanted her shrouded in enough vagueness that any reaction could justifiably be on the table, because unlike She-Ra's writers, they were not confident that seeing the character unfold naturally would be entertaining enough, without the need for purposefully withholding information in service of cheap shock value. But also, it's a refreshing tonic from the hero's friendship and unicorn's optimism to have a bad guy who just wants to kill themselves and take everybody with them. And lastly, comedy. And you might be thinking, after the fairly serious analysis of circumstance and cognition, that comedy doesn't really fit in here, or that it's not as important as the other two in terms of building complex, entertaining characters. But I am inclined to think that when character-driven and treated with enough respect, comedy might just be the most important one of these three. Especially in She-Ra. It is the glue that holds the whole thing together. Comedy is important in serious stories. Moments of levity can help provide respite from an otherwise oppressive tone and shake up the pacing. And they also help to humanise characters to demonstrate that they are capable of happiness despite dire circumstances, and that it's worth rooting for them in their quest to attain that happiness. Like the other two, everything feeds off each other. It's a snowball effect. Good cognition and circumstance breeds good comedy, and good comedy cements good character. It's the show's rich sense of character which gets people to invest in what is, let's face it, a fairly generic good faction, bad faction conflict, but it also helps to provide the show with some great moments of humour. Whether it's Adora's empty-headed heroism, Glimmer's angsty spats with her mum, or Mimista just being done with everyone and everything around her, She-Ra's humour is charmingly character-driven. I think I first noticed this in one of the early episodes, where Adora pretends to know what an ant was, that's A-U-N-T, when the heroes first meet Glimmer's aunt Castor. Initially, the sheer absurdity of the protagonist being so dense that she doesn't understand basic familial relationships was funny to me. It was the first time the show really got me to laugh. But on rewatch, it's obvious that this gag works not merely because the absurdity is funny in its own right, but because it's drawing on some very specific but ever-present aspects of Adora's personality and her history. One, Adora doesn't understand how the world outside the Horde functions because she spent her whole life eating propaganda for breakfast. And two, Adora never wants to appear weak or unknowledgeable because the Horde is built on the idea that imperfections must be eradicated. That's why when the alien concept of somebody's aunt comes up in conversation, she unconvincingly pretends to go along with it. But not only are these two aspects of Adora's personality referenced here in a comedic way, we also see them later built upon in comedic ways in later episodes. Adora's complete ignorance of how Etherian society functions makes up the bulk of the jokes in the Season 2 episode Reunion, and in season 3, Adora's need to appear knowledgeable, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, drives her comedic efforts to impress Huntara. That is character development, even if it's done entirely through jokes. Attributes were raised in one episode, then expanded on in later ones in an internally consistent, logical way. It's one of the great ways that She-Ra builds its characters. By treating comedy and tragedy as two sides of the same coin, it uses both to continuously reinforce ideas about the characters and develop them in a way that doesn't feel like retreading old ground. Taking Adora's distaste for appearing weak, when she was with the Horde, this was about displaying strength and superiority as part of a militarized society. When she joins the good guys, this doesn't simply vanish, but it is morphed by Adora's new outlook on life. It becomes her need to be strong for others and put them before herself, to the point of being self-sacrificing if need be. As heroic as it is, this compulsion to ignore her own desires and her own safety in favour of everyone else still comes from the same unhealthy outlook of never wanting to show vulnerability or weakness, and it is one of the final internal demons that Adora has to deal with. And by drawing on those same character flaws as a constant source of humour, it helps to keep them fresh in the audience's mind and ultimately helps to create more impact for the corresponding moments of drama. That is to say, in an abstract way, that both this tense, emotional scene with Adora and Mara and this dumbass joke about Adora not knowing what somebody's aunt means both stem from the same place in Adora's character. Hell, you could take this further and look at why the Horde ingrains this mindset in its soldiers, why the Horde hates the idea of imperfection, and link that through to every character that it has an impact on. But the point is, the show understands how to build interesting character through both drama and comedy. And this is just 1 or 2 points from one character. There are dozens of aspects of dozens of characters which can be analysed in this way. And I don't think the show really drops the ball on any of them except Swiftwind. And it would be very wrong for me to talk about how well the show presents its characters without noting how incredible the voice acting and directing is. I'll admit, I'm not always someone who stops to actively consider voice acting in every show I'm watching. Sometimes it just washes over me, but here I cannot help but admire it. Whether it's supposed to be conversational, emotional, funny or kinetic, almost every line is delivered perfectly, and it does so much to sell the intention of the writing, especially in a cartoon like this where the animation isn't always its strongest suit. So well done to the voice actors and the directing team, because they knocked this one out of the park. The line readings add so much warmth to the comedy, but it's our understanding of the characters and their tragedies that make the jokes land. It becomes a self-perpetuating process in which tragedy deepens our appreciation of the comedy and vice versa, because both sides are grounded in the realities of these characters. Character-driven comedy is more effective the more the audience understands about the character. So in a show like She-Ra, where the appeal is largely the characters, it is a great use of screen time between the more serious moments to use character-driven comedy to reinforce the ideas behind the character and reward the audience for investing in them. Listen, She-Ra is not a perfect show, far from it in some regards. The action choreography rarely registers above mediocre, the world building can feel very thrown together, the central conflict is pretty two-dimensional. For the most part, the animation itself isn't anything out of the ordinary, and there are certain plot lines that feel either glossed over, dropped, or that didn't really amount to much. As much as I've praised She-Ra here, there are some definite valid weaknesses that it has. However, perhaps the show's greatest strength is knowing its own weaknesses. The creators behind the show clearly understood which parts of She-Ra they could make as strong as possible and what aspects of the show the fans would be coming back to see. As you might have guessed, those aspects are building an entertaining and engaging cast of characters, except for Swiftwind, and putting the focus on their interactions, relationships, and dramas. It sounds obvious, it sounds simple, but I've seen too many shows fall apart or lose focus because they fail to recognise what the audience is there for. And I'm not talking about blatantly pandering to fans, but very few stories can be everything to everyone. So it's a credit to She-Ra for knowing what its strengths are and sticking to them. It isn't that good at world building or action, so it doesn't waste a ton of time indulging in them. It's much better at character building and drama, so that's where it commits most of its screen time. And it is such a good call because it allows the story to delve into these characters so completely in so many different ways, of which I've only touched on 2 or 3 in this video. On its surface, She-Ra really doesn't look like it's got a lot going on. I've already mentioned how surprised I am that I liked it as much as I do. I had judged this book by its cover, but on watching the show and scratching that surface, it's only when you get to know its cast of entertaining, relatable and effectively executed characters that you can appreciate just how much the show is doing right, and appreciate how good character can elevate what might have otherwise been something fairly mediocre into something far more special and heartfelt. Creating a compelling character is not easy. There are so many variables depending on what story you're trying to tell, what message you're trying to get across, how people will relate to them, where do they come from, what do they need, where is their arc. There are no quick and easy answers to these questions, and even when you're happy with them, it's another skill entirely to tell a story that satisfies these requirements that you've laid out, and a delicate balancing act to do so while juggling half a dozen other characters, all with their own journeys. There is a lot of talent which went into what She-Ra accomplishes with its characters, and while this video isn't any sort of formal evaluation, I hope it's helped highlight some of the craftsmanship which went into the show that's become my surprise highlight of 2020. So yes, we might not have gotten a proper conclusion to Glimmer, I'm freaking dead, Glimmer! But whatever, you know, I'm sure that'll be covered when Netflix gives us the movie. Anyway, this video has been going on way too long as it is, and I didn't even get to talk about some of the side characters like Mamister or Seahawk or Lighthope or the BLT sandwich. So, I don't know, maybe I'll do another video someday, but until then, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please check out my dumb shit video on Avatar: The Last Airbender.